the grandeur of Darius, the immeasurable power of the Persian king. My dearest friends, settle in and let the quiet of the evening draw us into a journey through time. Tonight, we travel not to a place but to a moment, a single, extraordinary day that became a pivot point for the world. We are going to the plain of Marathon, but to truly appreciate the small, brave flicker of light that shone there, we must first understand the shadow that was cast over it. This tale begins not with the Greeks, but with their colossal adversary, an empire so vast its resources seemed limitless. Imagine, if you will, the world around the year 492 BCE. To the west, the Hellenes, the ancient Greeks, existed in a brilliant, chaotic mosaic of independent city-states, each known as a polis. There was Athens, a fledgling democracy buzzing with philosophical inquiry and a new radical idea of self-rule. There was Sparta, austere and formidable, its people dedicated entirely to the art of war, and dozens of smaller, vibrant communities, all squabbling, trading and sharing a common cultural heritage, nestled around the jagged coastlines of the Aegean Sea. They cherished their freedom, their autonomia above all else. But move your gaze east, far beyond the water, and the scale of human endeavor utterly changes. There lies the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a realm stretching across 3 continents, from the fertile banks of the Nile to the dusty plains beyond the Indus River. This empire was the creation and domain of King Darius the Great, the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. His power was absolute, his will law, and his wealth incalculable. Picture the great king himself, seated upon his elaborate throne in the spectacular palace complexes of Susa or Persepolis. He ruled over an ordered universe. The Persian Empire was a marvel of administration, connected by the famous royal road stretching over 1,500 miles, served by swift couriers who ensured that news and imperial decrees reached every corner with astonishing speed. Its currency was stable, its governance sophisticated, and its policy toward most conquered peoples remarkably tolerant, as long as they paid their tribute and obeyed the king's peace, the Pax Persica. For Darius, the empire represented the highest form of order ordained by the supreme deity Ahura Mazda. To maintain this colossal dominion, Darius commanded an immense, disciplined army. At its core were the legendary 10,000 immortals, an elite infantry unit whose ranks were always maintained precisely at 10,000, constantly replaced as men fell. These soldiers were the pinnacle of Persian military might. Supplementing them were legions of professional infantry skilled archers who could launch volleys so dense they were said to darken the sky, and crucially, a superb corps of cavalry light, swift and capable of delivering devastating shock attacks on open ground. For the Persians, warfare was a massive coordinated effort relying on overwhelming numbers, sophisticated logistics, and a diversity of military forces working in concert. From this immense, magnificent perspective, how did the great king view the Greeks as a periphery, an unruly collection of mountain-dwelling tribes that caused occasional trouble on his western frontier? Most of the Hellenic world was already his. The vibrant Greek cities of Ionia, located along the western coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, had been brought into the imperial fold decades earlier. Cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus were crucial centers of trade, and while they retained some elements of Greek culture, they were governed by local Greek tyrants who were effectively puppets of the great king's satraps. But the nature of the Greek spirit is restless, and the price of the Pax Persica tribute and obedience was a constant affront to their cherished tradition of Eleutheria or self-determination. The Ionians were Greeks, and they yearned for the right to choose their own leaders, to make their own laws. The resentment simmered for years, a persistent, low-burning fire beneath the surface of the empire's grand stability. The pressure cooker finally blew in 499 BCE. The city of Miletus, the most powerful of the Ionian cities, became the unlikely spark. Its tyrant Aristagoras, an ambitious man caught between his Persian masters and his restless Ionian subjects, made a reckless move. After a failed joint military expedition, he saw his position threatened and sought a desperate way out. In a moment of audacious political theatre, he publicly renounced his tyranny, declared Miletus a free city, and called upon all the other Ionian cities to join him in casting off the Persian yoke. The Ionian revolt had begun. The news spread rapidly, fueled by hope and desperation. City after city embraced democracy and rebellion. The flames of liberty were momentarily rekindled across the coast of Asia Minor. But freedom against an empire of such magnitude is an expensive commodity. The Ionians knew they could not hold out alone. They needed the help of their powerful mainland kin. The future of their movement depended on their ability to convince the giants of mainland Greece, Sparta, and Athens to risk the full wrath of the King of Kings. The clock was ticking, and with every passing day, the logistical machinery of Persian retribution drew closer to crushing the revolt. The next crucial step in our story is the desperate diplomatic mission that set this great conflict in motion, an appeal that was rebuffed by the greatest military power in Greece, but embraced by the newest and most dangerous revolutionary in the world, the fledgling democracy of Athens. This decision, seemingly insignificant at the time, would be interpreted by Darius not as an act of aid, but as an unforgivable act of aggression, a deliberate poking of the Persian bear. And the consequences, my friends, would be paid in bronze and blood on the plains of Marathon. The stage is set for a choice that will change the course of history forever. The Ionian spark, the 25 ships of Defiance. The night deepens, my friends, and as the world outside falls silent, we return to that moment of desperation on the fringes of the Persian Colossus. We left the Ionian revolt, kindled a bright but vulnerable flame of freedom on the coast of Asia Minor. Its leader, Aristagoras of Miletus, knew that mere defiance would not sustain them. He needed a shield, and he looked to the most powerful military entities in the Greek world, Sparta and Athens. Imagine Aristagoras, the city-bred, silver-tongued politician, undertaking the long, arduous journey to the Peloponnese, arriving first in the land of Laconia. He stepped into a world utterly alien to his own sophisticated trading culture. Sparta was not a city of marble theatres and bustling markets. It was a rugged, severe military camp, a place where the life of every citizen was dedicated to the state and the preservation of internal order against the enslaved helots. Their entire existence was a focused, relentless training for the battlefield. Aristagoras was ushered before the Spartan king Cleomenes while in the council of elders, men known for their legendary brevity of speech, their laconic style. He began with a tempting proposition, not of freedom, but of riches. He spoke of the wealth of the Persian satrapies, the soft life of the king's subjects, and the ease with which such treasures could be plundered. He presented a geographical curiosity, a map etched upon bronze, a rare and startling object in the ancient world, tracing the coastlines and routes leading eastward. Aristagoras traced a line of conquest that would secure the Spartans' vast, fertile lands. But the Spartan mind worked differently. They valued stability and proximity. They listened patiently as the Ionian rattled off the names of provinces. Finally, Cleomenes interrupted him, asking a single piercing question. "How far is the great king's capital, Susa, from the sea?" Aristagoras, forced to be honest, replied that it was a 3-month journey inland. Cleomenes, without hesitation or fanfare, rose from his seat. The proposition was instantly dismissed. For the Spartans, the risk was too remote, the journey too long, and the threat to their immediate Peloponnesian interests too negligible. They would not commit their precious resources to an adventure 3 months from the coast. As he was being ushered out, Cleomenes reportedly stopped the desperate Ionian, warning him, "Stranger, you had better leave Sparta before you corrupt the king." Spartan priorities were clear: their own security first. The Ionians were left to their fate. Disheartened, Aristagoras pressed on, travelling to the city that was the very antithesis of Sparta, Athens. He found a city alive with intellectual ferment, commercial energy, and most importantly, political passion. Here, the ideals of democracy were barely 2 decades old, and the citizens, the free men of Attica, were fiercely protective of their hard-won right to govern themselves. They saw their freedom, their Eleutheria, not as a mere political state, but as a moral birthright. Aristagoras changed his pitch. He appealed not to greed, but to kinship and ideology. He reminded the Athenians that the Ionians were their colonists, their blood relatives sharing language and traditions. He spoke of the shared danger of Persian despotism, a dark, oppressive shadow that threatened to smother all Greek liberty. Crucially, he tapped into a wellspring of Athenian shame. A few years prior, in a moment of political misjudgment, Athenian envoys had gone to Sardis to seek a temporary alliance against Sparta. The Persian satrap demanded the traditional tokens of submission, earth and water. The envoys, either foolishly or in their haste to secure the alliance, had complied. Upon their return, the Athenians realized the profound symbolic meaning of their act. They had acknowledged Darius as their master. The assembly was horrified by this perceived surrender of their freedom, and the memory of that humiliation was a festering wound on their collective pride. To help the Ionians was, in a sense, to wash away that stain. The Athenian assembly debated the matter with the spirited, often noisy energy characteristic of a young democracy. The vote was taken and the decision was made: Athens would send aid. They dispatched 20 swift triremes oared warships to the aid of the Ionian cause. The small nearby island city of Eretria, sharing a similar democratic impulse and fear of Persian expansion, added 5 ships of its own. 25 ships, that's all. 25 small vessels sailing eastward into the teeth of an empire that could command fleets 100 strong. It was an act of profound courage, of reckless idealism, and in the eyes of King Darius, an act of unprovoked high seas banditry. In 498 BCE, this small Hellenic force, combining with the Ionian rebels, achieved its moment of shocking, unparalleled audacity. They marched inland and attacked Sardis, the great king's regional capital. The assault was successful and the city was set on fire. The flames consumed much of the city, including the local sanctuary of the goddess Cybele, a deeply sacred site to the Anatolian people, who were often allies of the Persians. The audacity of this action, a foreign assault on a major imperial capital, the sacrilege of burning a revered temple, was an affront of the highest order. When the news reached Darius, the King of Kings did not simply view it as a military setback. He viewed it as a personal divine insult. The historian Herodotus tells us of the great king's intense burning rage, fueled not just by policy, but by pride. He vowed vengeance upon those who had dared to instigate revolt and defile his territories. He had a royal servant appointed with a single, chilling duty to repeat to him 3 times at every meal the relentless, haunting phrase, "Master, remember the Athenians." The commitment was now absolute. The flames of Sardis had not ignited Greek freedom. They had merely sealed the fate of the mainland Greeks. With the memory of that vow burning in the Persian heart, the massive machinery of the empire began its inexorable movement. The revolt was systematically and brutally crushed. Naval engagements were won by the Persians through overwhelming force and clever diplomacy, including the decisive Battle of Lade in 494 BCE. The Ionian fleets were shattered, many ships defecting, others destroyed. The punishment for Miletus, the instigator, was particularly terrible. The city was besieged, captured, and utterly destroyed. Its male population was killed, and its women and children were taken as slaves and deported far across the empire. The harbour was deliberately choked with silt, ensuring the great city could never rise again as a naval power. The message delivered to the rest of the Greek world was chillingly clear: this is the price of defiance. The Ionian dream was over. The flames of Sardis had been extinguished by the blood and ruin of Miletus. But the focus of the great king had not shifted. The problem was no longer the Ionian subject, but the Athenian instigator. The vast resources of the empire would now be dedicated to fulfilling the king's solemn vow, to collecting the debt owed by the insolent city that dared to challenge his divine authority. The expedition of vengeance was now inevitable. The only question remaining was when and where the king's chosen commanders would exact their price. The vengeance vow, the great king's unyielding resolution. My friends, the air grows heavy, now charged with the palpable tension of anticipation. We have witnessed the Ionian revolt ignite and then be brutally crushed, but the true consequence of those 25 ships of defiance is only just beginning to unfold. For King Darius, the matter was no longer one of internal rebellion. It was a matter of state honor, of divine decree, and of establishing the absolute boundaries of his empire. The memory of the flames that engulfed Sardis, the impudence of the Athenians, and the chilling, thrice-daily reminder, "Master, remember the Athenians," had galvanized the most powerful ruler on earth into action. The period immediately following the suppression of Ionia was not one of peace, but of meticulous, colossal preparation for war. Darius was a pragmatic ruler, not merely a vengeful one. He understood that any lasting punishment of the Greek mainland would require 2 things: securing the necessary infrastructure and testing the routes of invasion. His first attempt, a massive undertaking designed to bring order to the unruly Greek world, occurred in 492 BCE. This expedition was entrusted to his son-in-law Mardonius, a capable general known for his ambition and administrative skill. Mardonius's goals were comprehensive. He was to consolidate Persian control over Thrace and Macedon, essentially extending the Persian border to the northern edges of the Greek mainland. This would secure a vital land corridor for future campaigns and bring the resource-rich regions of the north into the imperial fold. Mardonius launched his campaign with an immense force, utilizing both a large land army marching along the coast and a supporting fleet sailing alongside. he successfully achieved his political and territorial goals, subjugating the various tribes and kingdoms along the northern Aegean. However, fate, or perhaps the capricious will of the Greek sea god Poseidon, intervened with catastrophic results. As Mardonius's massive fleet attempted to round the treacherous rocky cape of Mount Athos, a mountainous peninsula jutting sharply into the Aegean, a sudden violent storm descended upon them. This was no ordinary squall. The gale was so ferocious, so sudden that the ships sailing close to the dangerous coastline were smashed mercilessly against the rocks. The devastation was immense. Hundreds of ships, by some ancient accounts perhaps 300, were utterly destroyed, sinking along with an estimated 20,000 men. This was a catastrophic loss of life material and prestige. Mardonius himself was injured and forced to retreat, the surviving remnants of his force limping back to Asia. The invasion was aborted, and the Greeks, though untouched by the Persian sword, saw the hand of the gods in their deliverance. For Darius this was a severe blow, but his resolve remained unbroken. The King of Kings was not accustomed to being thwarted by weather. The failure of the Mardonius expedition taught him a crucial lesson. The northern land route was too long, too exposed, and the sea passage around Athos too dangerous for a massive combined operation. He needed a swifter, more direct route for his punitive strike. The focus shifted from grand conquest to surgical punishment. Darius resolved to launch a wholly amphibious operation, a strike straight across the Aegean Sea, aimed directly at the heart of the two offending cities, Eretria and Athens. This new expedition would not attempt to conquer Thrace or Macedonia. It would be swift, brutal, and aimed solely at vengeance. Darius appointed two new, highly capable commanders to lead this delicate and decisive mission. In 490 BCE, Datis, a distinguished Median admiral known for his seafaring skill, and Artaphernes, a nephew of Darius himself, ensuring the expedition carried the full weight of the Achaemenid royal authority. The fleet they assembled was enormous again, estimated by the Greeks at around 600 ships, a staggering logistical feat. These were not just transports, they were swift triremes, armed with marines carrying thousands of specialized infantry, particularly the famed Persian and Saka archers and the lethal cavalry. The strategy was simple and terrifying: sail south through the Cyclades, demanding submission from all islands along the way, then strike Eretria and Athens, making an unforgettable example of both, and return home with the spoils of victory and the enslaved citizens as proof of the king's power. Before the fleet set sail, Darius took one final telling action. He dispatched envoys across the Greek world, traveling to the major city-states and demanding the traditional tokens of submission, earth and water. This act was a shrewd diplomatic maneuver. It allowed Darius to gauge the resistance he would face and force Greek cities to publicly declare their loyalty or their defiance. Many small cities and islands, understandably terrified by the immense power arrayed against them, and the recent example of Ionia, complied. They gave the tokens, bowing to the inevitable, but when the envoys arrived at Sparta and Athens, they met with the full, unyielding force of Hellenic pride. The responses became legendary acts of defiance. In Sparta, the envoys were reportedly thrown into a well and told to dig up your earth and water for yourselves. In Athens, they were thrown into a chasm. Such acts, barbaric though they were, cemented the resolve of these two most powerful states. They had irrevocably chosen the path of war. The Persian fleet set sail. It bypassed the treacherous Mount Athos and swept through the Cyclades. The islands, isolated and unable to resist, were systematically brought to heel. Naxos, which had resisted earlier Persian attempts, was subdued and forced to pay tribute. The Persian commanders were careful, however, to mix terror with respect. When they came to the sacred island of Delos, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis Datis, showed remarkable reverence, forbidding his ships from landing and sending a message of peace and honor to the sanctuary. This was calculated strategy, show clemency to those who did not defy the king, reserving all wrath for the 2 cities that dared to burn his temples and provoke his ire. The message delivered through fear and selective mercy was travelling ahead of the fleet. Every Greek knew who the true targets were. The immense fleet sailing south and then west had reached the island of Euboea. Eretria, the smaller of the 2 culprits, was about to receive the first chilling dose of the great king's vengeance. The world was holding its breath. The storm that Mardonius could not navigate was now replaced by the grim determination of the largest amphibious force the world had yet seen. The stage for the first battle for the soul of Greece was nearly complete. The tide of terror, the fall of Eretria, and the coming storm. My friends, the journey across the ancient sea brings us now to a moment of deep dread, where the vastness of the Persian Empire made its intentions horribly clear. We left the massive amphibious force of Datis and Artaphernes, having secured the Cyclades, their formidable fleet, steering toward the island of Euboea. Their target was the first of the 2 cities marked for destruction, Eretria, the small city that had foolishly contributed 5 ships to the Ionian revolt. The great king's vow of vengeance was about to be fulfilled. The Persian fleet, an imposing spectacle of hundreds of ships, landed near Eretria, and the army disembarked swiftly, establishing a vast camp. The Eretrians, facing an enemy that outnumbered their city's entire population, were paralyzed by fear and internal division. This division, my friends, is a recurring tragedy in Greek history, the inability to maintain unity in the face of existential threat. Inside the walls of Eretria there was a bitter debate. Some citizens, driven by desperation, advocated for a staunch defense, manning the walls and fighting to the last man. Others, perhaps more realistic about the odds, urged abandoning the city entirely and retreating into the surrounding mountains to wage a guerrilla war. A third, cynical faction comprised of those seeking political gain or simply terrified into submission argued for surrender. The lack of unified action proved fatal. The Eretrians chose a middle and ultimately a weak path. They decided to remain behind their defensive walls, hoping to withstand a siege, but lacking the necessary internal cohesion and resolution to sustain it. The siege began a grim and relentless affair. For 6 days, the Persian army, utilizing its superior engineering and overwhelming numbers, assaulted the city walls. Day after day, the Eretrians fought bravely, repelling the initial waves. But the Persian commanders knew that time was on their side. They simply had to wait for the internal fractures within the Greek city to give way. And tragically, they were right. On the 7th day, the city fell not to a breached wall, but to betrayal. 2 prominent Eretrian citizens, whose names are preserved in infamy, opened the city gates to the Persians. We do not know their motives. Were they collaborators seeking clemency, or simply men broken by the fear of utter destruction? Whatever the reason, the gates swung open, and the Persian troops poured into the city. The ensuing scene was the very definition of a punitive strike. The memory of the temple of Cybele, burnt by the Athenians and Eretrians in Sardis, drove the Persian action. Eretria was mercilessly plundered. All the city's temples, sacred to the Greeks, were deliberately looted and burned to the ground. This was not mere military conquest. It was symbolic retaliation, a mirror image of the insult delivered years before. The city itself was effectively annihilated as a functioning political entity. The Eretrian people were gathered up, the survivors, the women, the children, and enslaved. They were bound and led in chains, an endless column of misery marched down to the waiting ships. Datis and Artaphernes had executed their orders to the letter. They had secured the first part of their vengeance, leaving behind them a smoking ruin and a chilling, unambiguous warning for every other Greek city-state. The fate of Eretria was meant to paralyze resistance across the Aegean. The great king's wrath was real, immediate, and utterly devastating. The Persian commanders wasted no time. With Eretria neutralized, they prepared for the final, most crucial target, Athens. They had a specific destination in mind chosen for its geography and its proximity to their goal, the plain of Marathon, some 26 miles northeast of Athens itself. Why Marathon? This choice was no accident. It was a move of deliberate strategic brilliance, undoubtedly guided by Greek informants and traitors serving the Persian cause. The most influential of these advisors was likely Hippias, the aging former tyrant of Athens. Hippias, who had been expelled from the city decades before, was now a bitter exile sailing with the Persian fleet. He offered the Persians not just geographical advice but crucial political intelligence, assuring them that many Athenians, those who resented the new democracy, would rise up to support him upon landing. The plain of Marathon was strategically perfect for the Persian forces for two critical reasons. First, it was a vast open expanse approximately 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. This was the ideal ground for deploying their overwhelming numbers of infantry and, most importantly, for utilizing the deadly speed and maneuverability of their cavalry. The Persian commanders knew that if they could force the Athenian heavy infantry, the Hoplites, to fight on this flat, open terrain, their superior numbers and cavalry charge would break the Greek line with ease. Second, it offered a secure, suitable landing and staging area. The long crescent-shaped bay provided deep water for the fleet and a wide beach for the army to disembark and organize themselves without immediate threat. It was a perfect tactical staging point, close enough to threaten Athens directly, but far enough away that the Athenian army would have to march out and fight them on ground of the Persians' choosing. The Persian fleet sailed from Euboea across the narrow strait and landed at Marathon likely in early September of 490 BCE. Imagine the sight: the entire bay filled with the sails of hundreds of ships disgorging thousands upon thousands of soldiers onto the sandy shore. The Persian camp quickly took shape, a massive, vibrant intrusion onto the quiet, rural plain of Attica. The total number of Persian combatants is a matter of historical debate, but modern estimates typically place the fighting strength between 25,000 and 30,000 soldiers, including elite infantry archers and the powerful cavalry arm. For the Athenians, the news arrived with devastating speed. Eretria was annihilated, and the great king's army had landed on their own sacred soil. The chilling reality of the Persian threat, which had once seemed distant, was now less than a day's march from their walls. The democracy, that fragile experiment in self-rule, faced its ultimate moment of truth. They were completely alone, facing a force that had just demonstrated its power by crushing their ally. The time for debate was over. The only hope lay in the speed of their response, and the first desperate measure they undertook was a plea to the only other power in Greece capable of matching the Persian military Sparta. The stage was set for the legendary run of the messenger, a journey of agony, hope, and despair, which would define the crucial days before the battle. The chosen plain, geography, logistics, and the Persian landing. The grim account of Eretria's fall, my friends, must have sent a wave of paralyzing terror across the Greek world. But as we continue our story, we must now focus our gaze on the geography of destiny itself, the plain of Marathon. The Persian generals Datis and Artaphernes had chosen this site not by chance, but by design, ensuring every strategic advantage lay with the immense force of the great king. Let us immerse ourselves in the physical reality of the battlefield. The plain of Marathon is a coastal area in Attica, forming a vast, shallow crescent stretching roughly 6 miles along the bay. It is bordered abruptly to the west by the foothills of Mount Penteli, and to the north and south by areas of dense marshland. This blend of open plain, rugged mountains, and impassable swamps created a very specific contained battlefield. The Persian commanders saw only one thing: ideal ground for cavalry and massed infantry. The fleet, having crossed the strait from Euboea, anchored in the bay in early September of 490 BCE. The disembarkation was a marvel of ancient logistics. Hundreds of ships, swift triremes, and heavy horse transports lined the shore. The army that streamed onto the beaches was a colourful, diverse, and terrifying sight. Unlike the homogeneous Athenian army, composed almost entirely of bronze-clad citizen soldiers, the Persian force was a multicultural mosaic drawn from every corner of the empire. The corps was made up of Persian and Median infantry, often carrying wicker shields, and dressed in trousers and caps armed with short spears, daggers, and most crucially, the composite bow. These archers were the heart of the Persian strategy. They could unleash volleys of arrows at range, decimating an enemy formation before a single sword was drawn. Supporting them were contingents of elite Sarca-Scythian soldiers and various subject levies, all lightly armed and designed for speed and maneuverability. The most feared element of the Persian army, however, was its cavalry. These horsemen were the heavy hitters, the shock troops trained to charge across open ground, smashing infantry formations and running down fleeing foes. Marathon's open plain was to the Persians a clear invitation to use this crucial asset to its maximum potential. Their commanders calculated that the Athenians, if they dared to face them here, would be annihilated by the thunderous hooves and superior firepower. Guiding the Persian actions and feeding them crucial political intelligence was the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias. For decades, Hippias had nursed a bitter resentment against the democracy that had overthrown him. Now an old man, he sailed with the Persian fleet, believing that the king's forces were the divine instrument of his restoration. He was the quintessential collaborator, assuring Datis and Artaphernes that his supporters within Athens would rise up and open the city gates once the main Athenian army was engaged and defeated at Marathon. For the Persians, this was not a desperate gamble. It was a strategically sound operation supported by internal political divisions. Their plan was straightforward: crush the Athenian army at Marathon, then sail the fleet quickly around to the undefended port of Phaleron and occupy the city in conjunction with Hippias's anticipated coup. Meanwhile, news of the Persian landing reached Athens with terrifying speed. The city was thrown into crisis. There was no longer any ambiguity. The enemy was on the sacred soil of Attica, less than a day's march away. The immediate question facing the Athenian assembly and the 10 elected generals, the strategoi, was, what do we do now? Some, overwhelmed by the news of Eretria's destruction and the sheer size of the Persian force, advocated for a desperate defensive move, barricading themselves behind the walls of Athens and waiting for aid. They knew their strength, perhaps 9,000 to 10,000 hoplites, was dwarfed by the Persian numbers, and they feared facing the formidable cavalry on the open plain. But the general who would rise to prominence in this moment of existential dread, Miltiades, argued fiercely for immediate action. Miltiades was a remarkable figure, a former tyrant himself who had once ruled a semi-independent Greek colony in the Thracian Chersonese, making him intimately familiar with Persian military methods, strengths, and crucially their weaknesses. He knew that allowing the Persians to march on Athens unopposed would not only demoralize the citizens, but would also encourage the internal treachery promised by Hippias. He insisted that the salvation of the democracy lay not in waiting, but in a swift, decisive move to control the ground. The assembly, swayed by Miltiades' urgent and knowledgeable counsel, made a fateful decision. They would march the entire force of the Athenian citizen hoplites out to Marathon. They would meet the enemy on the field. As the Athenian army, a corps of perhaps 9,000 heavy infantry mobilized, they sent a desperate message to their only powerful potential ally, Sparta. The democracy was asking the greatest martial state in Greece to come to its aid in the face of annihilation. But the distance to Sparta was vast, about 150 miles, 240 kilometers of rugged terrain, and the danger was immediate. The one chosen for this monumental mission was a long-distance runner named Pheidippides or Philippides. We pause our military narrative here, my friends, because this messenger's run is a testament to the sheer, desperate physical effort that underpins this entire story. This was not the run after the battle, which is the root of the modern marathon, but the agonizing run before the battle. Pheidippides was a professional hemerodromus, a day runner, a man trained to cover immense distances at speed. Imagine him now stripped down to almost nothing, his body conditioned for endurance, sprinting out of the panic-stricken city of Athens across the mountains and passes of the Peloponnese. His task was to cover 150 miles of hostile, difficult terrain in under 2 days, bearing a single, terrifying message: Athenians call upon you to help them and not stand by while the most ancient city of Greece is being crushed by a foreign foe. It was a race against time, a desperate hope carried on the legs of one exhausted man whose success or failure would determine if the Athenians fought alone. The fate of Athens rested momentarily not on a general's strategy, but on a runner's indomitable will. The Olympian run Pheidippides and the plea to Sparta. My friends, let us follow the single solitary figure carrying the weight of Athenian fear and hope. We speak of Pheidippides, the hemerodromos, the day runner, whose desperate mission was the first act of defiance in the looming conflict. We left him sprinting out of Athens, carrying a plea for immediate military assistance to Sparta, a city that lay over 150 rugged miles away. Imagine the solitude of his run. This was a journey of sheer punishing endurance across the mountains of Attica, through the Isthmus of Corinth, and over the high passes and hostile territories of the Peloponnese. He ran not for sport or glory, but under the immense pressure of an empire's imminent vengeance. For 36 continuous hours, fueled only by water dates and the terror of the advancing Persians, Pheidippides pushed his body to its absolute limit. He traversed a landscape that demanded respect, every stone, every steep incline a test of his resolve. According to the enduring tradition chronicled by Herodotus, Pheidippides reached Sparta on the second day. Picture the scene, the sweat-soaked runner dust-caked and gasping for breath, collapsing before the severe, powerful Spartan council. He delivered the Athenian message, his voice strained but clear. Men of Sparta, the Athenians ask you to help them and not stand by while the most ancient city of Greece is being crushed by a foreign foe. The Spartans listened, their discipline unwavering, their respect for this feat of endurance absolute. They were profoundly impressed by the urgency and the magnitude of the threat. They agreed in principle to send their famed Hoplites to aid Athens. After all, the defeat of Athens would remove a rival and leave Sparta dangerously exposed to future Persian designs. But then came the crushing caveat, a moment of tragic, bureaucratic fidelity to ancient law. The Spartan constitution, a rigid iron framework built around tradition and religious obligation, dictated their actions. It was the time of the Carneia, a major religious festival dedicated to the god Apollo. During this sacred time, Spartan law strictly forbade the army from marching out to war. To violate the Carneia would be an act of sacrilege, inviting the wrath of the gods upon their city. The Spartan response, delivered with cool military finality, was devastating to the Athenians. "We are willing to help you, Athenians," they declared, "but we may not violate our law. Our army will be ready to march only when the full moon has passed." The full moon was still 6 days away, 6 crucial days. The great king's army was camped at Marathon, barely a day's march from Athens. The Spartans, the only army capable of providing immediate decisive aid, were bound by a religious calendar. Pheidippides, his strength spent, could do nothing but turn around and begin the agonizing return journey, carrying the crushing news that Athens stood alone. His despair must have been profound, but his duty was absolute. It is during this desperate return that the legend adds an even more haunting detail. Pheidippides claimed to have had a supernatural encounter. While running through the rugged mountains of Arcadia, he heard the voice of the god Pan, the wild deity of the mountains and shepherds, who was also known for inspiring sudden, irrational fear, panic in men. Pan allegedly chided the runner, asking why the Athenians failed to worship him, since he was well disposed towards them and had often been of service to them in the past. This divine encounter, whether real or a hallucination born of exhaustion, became a significant part of the story, leading the Athenians after the battle to establish a sanctuary for Pan beneath the Acropolis, seeking to secure his favor. Meanwhile, back in Attica, the Athenian army was already in motion. Led by the 10 strategoi generals, they had marched the entire available force of hoplites, estimated at around 9,000 to 10,000 men, the 26 miles from Athens to the plain of Marathon. This was a monumental logistical and military commitment. The city of Athens was now practically undefended, its fate staked entirely on the shoulders of the men marching toward the coast. They knew that if they failed, the Persians would simply march around the mountains and occupy the defenseless city. As the Athenians marched, they were joined by a small but crucial force, the entire fighting contingent of the small Boeotian city of Plataea. Plataea was a tiny state politically dependent on Athens, but their commitment was total, about 1,000 Plataean hoplites, a brave and vital addition that brought the total Greek force to around 10,000 or 11,000 men. This act of loyalty from Plataea, a commitment of their entire military manpower, was never forgotten by the Athenians, and it cemented an alliance of enduring significance. The very fact that Plataea arrived instantly risking everything was a stark contrast to the distant, religiously bound hesitation of the Spartans. The Athenian and Plataean forces arrived at the plain of Marathon, not where the Persians had landed, but at the western edge of the plain, near the foothills. This was a tactical masterstroke likely engineered by Miltiades and the wiser generals. By positioning themselves here, the Greeks controlled the narrow exits from the plain, effectively blocking the Persian army from marching inland towards Athens. They also used the terrain to their advantage. The surrounding hills and the marshy areas to the north and south restricted the open ground, minimizing the space where the devastating Persian cavalry could operate freely. The Battle of Marathon was now, for a time, transformed into a tense standoff. The two armies faced each other across the plain, separated by a distance of perhaps a mile or slightly more. For several days, neither side moved. For the Persians, the standoff was frustrating but not immediately worrying. They were superior in numbers, they had secured their beachhead, and they were confident that the Greeks would eventually run out of supplies or patience, or that the internal Athenian treachery promised by Hippias would materialize. They could afford to wait. For the Athenians, the waiting was a profound ordeal. Every moment increased the pressure, the fear, and the logistical strain. They were aware that time was their enemy. They had only a few days' supplies, their homes were undefended, and the arrival of the Spartan army was still distant. They were trapped in a paralyzing existential dilemma. Should they risk battle now alone and vastly outnumbered on ground, still largely favorable to the Persian cavalry, or should they retreat to the walls of Athens, risking political collapse and the certainty of a siege? The fate of the battle, and perhaps the very nature of Western civilization, now rested on the agonizing, highly political deliberations within the Athenian War Council. The 10 strategoi, the elected generals, were divided, a mirror of the very democracy they defended. The decision to fight or wait could only be made through a vote, and that vote was split down the middle. The stage is set for a dramatic internal conflict, where the fate of thousands would be decided not by the clash of swords, but by the persuasiveness of a single general and the single critical vote of a civilian official. The tension on the plain of Marathon was almost unbearable, a silence that preceded the ultimate storm. The tense standoff, democracy's dilemma, and Miltiades' influence. My friends, we arrive now at the heart of the strategic crisis, where the entire fate of the Athenian democracy rested not on a military maneuver, but on a political argument. The two armies are locked in a tense standoff on the plain of Marathon. The Persian army, vast and multicolored, occupies the center and the shore, their banners waving under the Attic sun. The Greek force, smaller but resolute, is positioned at the base of the mountains, controlling the main passes leading inland to Athens. This period of waiting, which lasted several agonizing days, was a calculated move by the Athenian generals, the strategoi. Their position was tactically superb. The terrain neutralized the formidable Persian cavalry, forcing the king's commanders to consider fighting on unfavorable ground. The mountains protected the Greek flanks, and the marshlands to the north and south narrowed the front, making the Persian numerical superiority less decisive. The Greeks could hold this position indefinitely, but the political reality back in Athens made waiting impossible. The dilemma facing the Athenian leadership was existential. Every day the army remained at Marathon. The city of Athens itself lay virtually undefended. This prolonged absence created a dangerous vacuum, a fertile ground for the treachery promised by the exiled tyrant Hippias, who was currently camped with the Persians. The generals feared that the pro-tyranny faction in Athens would launch a coup, opening the city gates to the Persians while the citizen army was trapped miles away. If Athens fell politically, the battle at Marathon would become instantly meaningless. The very principle the men were fighting for democracy would be lost before a single spear was thrown. The Athenian leadership structure only compounded this paralysis. They were led by a council of 10 strategoi generals, one elected from each of the 10 Athenian tribes. The command rotated daily, meaning the strategy of the entire army could change every 24 hours, depending on which general held the reins. Adding another layer of complexity was the polemarch, or war archon, a civilian official named Callimachus, who technically commanded the entire army, holding the tie-breaking vote among the 10 generals. This democratic system, brilliant in peace, was dangerously clumsy in the face of a lightning military invasion. The 10 generals were bitterly divided over strategy. The stalemate was broken by a tense, fateful war council. The generals were split 5 against 5. On one side were those advocating caution and delay. They argued for waiting until the agreed-upon time when the Spartan army would arrive after the Carnea festival had passed. Their logic was simple. The Spartans were the professional military elite of Greece. Fighting without them against overwhelming odds and the deadly Persian cavalry was suicidal. Wait 6 days, gain 5,000 professional warriors, and then fight with a real chance of victory. On the other side stood the faction arguing for immediate attack, led by the most influential voice on the battlefield, Miltiades. Miltiades was a fascinating and complex figure. He was an aristocrat who had served as a local tyrant in the Thracian Chersonese, an area bordering the Persian Empire. This background was his greatest strength. He had served alongside the Persians. He knew their tactics, he understood their heavy reliance on archers and their vulnerability in close quarters combat against the heavy Greek phalanx. He had also witnessed firsthand the brutal efficiency of the Persian suppression of the Ionian revolt. Miltiades spoke with the passionate clarity of a man who understood the fleeting nature of opportunity and the urgency of political reality. He argued that waiting was a strategy for certain defeat. If they waited, 2 disastrous things would happen. First, political factions in Athens would surely betray the city to Hippias. Second, even if the city held a prolonged standoff, would allow the great king's generals, Datis and Artaphernes, to realize they were trapped. The Persians would simply re-embark their forces, sail around Cape Sunion, and land at the undefended port of Phaleron just outside Athens. The game would be lost. Miltiades' argument was powerful, resonating with the fiercely independent spirit of the Athenian hoplites, who were also citizen farmers and merchants desperate to return home. He insisted that the time to strike was now, while the Persians were still complacent, confident in their numerical superiority, and perhaps still reeling from the logistical chaos of landing and forming up. He articulated a core truth: the Greek hoplite was individually superior to the lightly armed Persian infantry, and in a hand-to-hand clash, the bronze armor and long spear of the phalanx would prevail over wicker shields and short swords. The only way to win was to initiate that brutal, terrifying close-quarters combat as quickly as possible, negating the Persian archers' range advantage. The debate came to a head. The vote was 5-5, a perfect deadlock. The decision now fell entirely to the polemarch, Callimachus. He was a civilian, not a professional soldier like the strategoi, but the legal power of the state rested in his hands. Miltiades turned his full persuasive power upon Callimachus. He understood that this man, the highest-ranking officer of the Athenian state, held the key to saving the democracy. His plea was both practical and philosophical. "Everything now depends on you, Callimachus. If you cast your vote with me, your country will be free, and your fame will be greater than that of Harmodius and Aristogeiton," he urged, referencing the legendary tyrannicides who were the founders of Athenian liberty. He continued painting a vivid picture of the alternative. "But if you vote with those who wish to avoid a battle, then Athens will be handed over to Hippias, and the glory of your fathers will be lost." This was the ultimate moment of political courage. Callimachus, faced with the weight of tradition, the terror of the Persian army, and the fiery conviction of Miltiades, made his choice. He cast his vote in favor of immediate battle. The deadlock was broken. The Athenians would fight, and they would fight now alone. The decision was made, but the implementation was yet to come. In a remarkable show of unified purpose following the contentious debate, the four generals who had ceded their turn of command to Miltiades agreed to cede their rotational command days to him as well. This gave Miltiades 5 consecutive days of undisputed command over the entire Greek force, allowing him to execute a single coherent strategy without the worry of having it changed by a cautious successor. The Athenian army was now under the absolute brilliant command of a single, experienced general. Miltiades had won the crucial political battle, but the military challenge remained terrifying. He had a few days to prepare the men and devise the one tactical masterstroke that might overcome the great king's immense power. The stage was set not just for a battle, but for a revolution in military tactics, the pivot of destiny, the tie-breaking vote, and the genius of Miltiades. The stillness that had settled over the plain of Marathon was now shattered, not by the clamour of war, but by the sheer, exhilarating weight of a democratic decision. The polemarch Callimachus had cast the decisive vote, ending the paralyzing stalemate among the 10 strategoi. Miltiades was now given the mandate the Athenians would fight, and they would do so immediately before the dreaded Persian cavalry could move, before Hippias's treachery could be enacted in Athens, and without the aid of the religiously constrained Spartans. This was a gamble of extraordinary proportions, a bet placed on the conviction of a single man. Miltiades, now the undisputed field commander for the critical coming days, immediately set about his preparations. This was where his unique experience, his deep knowledge of the Persian military machine came into play. He knew the strengths of the enemy, the overwhelming numbers, the terrifying range and volume of their archers, and the devastating speed of their cavalry. But he also knew their singular weakness. Their lightly armed infantry, armed often with wicker shields and short swords, was no match for the dense bronze-clad phalanx of the Greek hoplite in sustained close-quarters combat. The challenge was to negate the Persian advantages long enough to exploit their weakness. Miltiades needed a revolutionary tactical formation that could cover the maximum amount of ground, minimize exposure to archery, and withstand a breakthrough by the strongest elements of the Persian line. He studied the geography of the plain, confirming his earlier assessment. The Greek forces, now totaling about 10,000 to 11,000 hoplites, Athenians and the steadfast Plataeans were arrayed along the foothills. The distance separating the two armies across the width of the plain was crucial. Miltiades realized that to avoid being outflanked, to prevent the Persians from wrapping around his line and attacking his rear, he needed to stretch his army to match the length of the Persian front. This necessity led to a brilliant yet terrifying innovation, the deliberate thinning of the Greek center. Traditionally, the hoplite phalanx was deployed with a deep, robust center, sometimes 8 to 12 men deep, relying on weight and sheer pushing power, orthismos, to break the enemy line. Miltiades did the opposite. He drastically reduced the depth of the center to only 4 ranks deep, or perhaps even fewer, making it vulnerable and almost perilously thin. Where did that manpower go? It was moved to the wings. Miltiades heavily reinforced the Greek wings, stacking the flanks with the best and most experienced hoplites to a depth of 8 or more ranks. The logic behind this unusual deployment was audacious and psychologically brilliant. First, by stretching the line and reinforcing the wings, Miltiades achieved the necessary width to prevent the Persian forces from simply enveloping the Greeks. Second, and more importantly, he turned the perceived weakness of the Persian army into a trap. The Persian commanders Datis and Artaphernes naturally placed their strongest, most professional troops, elite Persians and Sacae, in their own center, directly opposite the Greek center. They expected to smash through the heart of the Greek line, achieving a decisive victory. Miltiades' thin center was designed to yield, to bend, drawing those elite Persian troops deeper and deeper into the killing ground, away from the protection of their archers and the rest of their vast army. The reinforced Greek wings, meanwhile, were designed to hold fast and then to execute a decisive tactical move once the Persian center was engaged and drawn inward. The powerful Greek wings would wheel inward, attacking the Persian flanks and rear, completing a devastating double envelopment. The center was a lure, the wings were the steel trap. This was a strategy born not just of courage but of deep strategic insight into the differences between Hellenic and Achaemenid warfare. Miltiades had secured his strategy. Now he waited for the precise moment to strike. The Persians, confident in their numbers and their commanding terrain, continued to wait, perhaps anticipating that the Greeks would be starved out, or perhaps waiting for the successful cavalry maneuver. And this brings us to one of the most debated and critical moments in the entire battle, the mysterious absence of the Persian cavalry. For Miltiades' plan to work the Persian cavalry, the most effective arm of the Persian military on that open ground, had to be neutralized. Why did the Persians not simply use their horsemen to sweep around the Greek flanks, or simply charge the Athenian center, which was barely 4 ranks deep? The outcome of the entire war might have rested on this single logistical misstep by the Persian commanders. The ancient sources, particularly the Byzantine dictionary known as the Suda, offer a tantalizing explanation. A signal was given, a shining shield was raised on the hill above the battlefield, and the Persians realized that the cavalry is away. Whether this shield signal was a prearranged message from Hippias's waiting collaborators in Athens, or a sign from the Persian commanders themselves, remains a mystery. However, the most widely accepted theory is logistical. The Persians, perhaps under the guidance of Hippias, were attempting to move their valuable cavalry to another better watered or more protected part of the plain, or most critically, they were in the process of re-embarking the cavalry onto the transports. Why re-embark the cavalry? Because having failed to break the Greek line in the days of the standoff, Datis and Artaphernes might have decided to change tactics. They might have planned to send the cavalry, the decisive force by sea, to the port of Phaleron to coordinate the attack on the undefended city of Athens, while their infantry engaged the Greek hoplites at Marathon. If the cavalry was on the transports, they would be completely unavailable for the battle itself. Whatever the reason, logistical preparation, tactical blunder, or a moment of temporary logistical chaos, Miltiades, with his deep knowledge of the enemy, recognized this momentary window of vulnerability. The feared Persian cavalry was momentarily absent from the field, or at least strategically neutralized. This was the moment he had gambled his life and his city on. Time was no longer his enemy, it was his fleeting, priceless opportunity. He gave the order that would commit the Athenians to their destiny. The moment for talk, for debate, for waiting was over. The order to charge was given. The decisive absence, the mystery of the missing cavalry. My friends, we now stand at the threshold of the battle itself, suspended in the electric moment between the general's command and the soldier's desperate charge. This pivot, this extraordinary shift from tense, waiting to immediate action, hinged upon a single unresolved question that historians still debate. Where was the Persian cavalry? As we discussed, the Persian cavalry was the most powerful, decisive force on the open ground of Marathon. They were the king's weapon of choice for shattering infantry formations. The Athenian phalanx, thinned to only 4 ranks in the centre, was perfectly vulnerable to a massive cavalry charge. Had the horsemen been present, the battle would likely have been a swift, brutal Persian victory. Yet they were not there. This crucial absence provided Miltiades with the singular, narrow window of opportunity for which he had gambled everything. He was a general who knew the logistics of the enemy better than his own countrymen, and he must have been watching the Persian camp with hawk-like intensity, waiting for any sign of a tactical shift or lapse in deployment. The explanations for this monumental blunder by the Persian generals Datis and Artaphernes are shrouded in the dust of history, but the theories are compelling, offering a glimpse into the chaos inherent in large-scale ancient warfare. One prevailing theory, supported by the ancient Greek dictionary known as the Suda, points to the phrase "the cavalry is away, chorisippes." This suggests the decision to launch the Greek attack was based on the recognition of the horsemen's temporary but complete absence. Theory 1, the strategic re-embarkation. This is the most strategically sound explanation. The Persian commanders had waited for days, achieving nothing but a frustrating stalemate. Their ultimate goal was not to win a difficult battle at Marathon, but to seize the undefended city of Athens, where the traitor Hippias promised an internal coup. The most logical move, seeing the Greek army refusing to leave the foothills, would be to use their naval superiority. Datis and Artaphernes may have decided to re-embark the cavalry onto the ships sailing them swiftly around Cape Sunion to the port of Phaleron, while the main Persian infantry kept the Greek hoplites pinned down at Marathon. If the cavalry, the essential rapid deployment force, was on the transports, they were unavailable for the fight. Miltiades, recognizing the lull in activity and the telltale signs of horses being led back to the ships, seized the moment. Theory 2, the collaboration signal. This theory is more dramatic, linked to the exiled tyrant Hippias. As the battle neared, Hippias, now an old man, was reportedly directing his collaborators in Athens to raise a shining shield on the hills above the city, signaling to the Persian fleet that the city was ready to betray its democracy and open its gates. When Miltiades and the generals saw this signal, they knew they had no time left. They had to defeat the army at Marathon before the fleet and its vital cavalry reached the city. The Greek attack was therefore a desperate preemptive strike forced by the fear of treachery at home. Theory 3, logistical mistake. The simplest explanation suggests a gross but temporary logistical error. Marathon was a large camp housing perhaps 30,000 men and thousands of horses. Horses need constant water and fodder, and managing such a large herd on the plain for days would have been a massive challenge. The cavalry units may have been led away to a nearby better-watered pasture, or were simply dismounted and resting temporarily decentralized from the main battle line. Miltiades, a former colleague of the Persians, understood that a sudden attack during this brief window would catch them completely unprepared to saddle mount and deploy their most powerful arm. Whatever the precise reason, the opportunity was clear and fleeting. Miltiades knew that every moment of delay now meant certain ruin. The Spartan aid was still days away, and the integrity of Athens itself was under the threat of internal collapse. The decision was made. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the plain. The Athenian and Plataean hoplites, standing side by side on the slopes, were given the order that defied all convention of Greek warfare. For generations, hoplite battles had begun with a slow, disciplined march, sometimes accompanied by flutes, the phalanx maintaining perfect alignment until the last possible moment. This allowed them to conserve energy and ensure the cohesion of their defensive wall of shields. Miltiades demanded something radically different to charge. The Athenian army was ordered to cover the distance, separating them from the enemy about 400 meters, or roughly a quarter of a mile, at a full run. Imagine that moment. It must have been terrifying, exhilarating, and completely exhausting. Thousands of men clad in 60 or 70 pounds of bronze armor, raising a cloud of dust, charging across open ground. They ran directly into the effective range of the deadly Persian archers. The air must have instantly been filled with the hiss and snap of thousands of arrows raining down on the charging ranks. Miltiades' tactical audacity was revealed in this charge. The run was not just a display of ferocious courage, it was a military necessity designed to neutralize the archers. The faster the Greeks closed the distance, the less time the Persians had to loose their arrows and the fewer casualties the Greeks would suffer. It minimized the time the hoplites were exposed to the overwhelming destructive power of the Persian composite bow. The effect on the Persians was one of utter astonishment. The historian Herodotus records that the Persians believed the Athenians were mad, rushing on at a run, having neither cavalry nor archers. They had never seen a Greek army fight like this. It defied every convention of battle. The charge covered the distance swiftly, a great bronze wave breaking onto the Persian line. The sound of the initial impact, the shock of bronze shield against wicker shield spear against linen tunic, must have been deafening. The dense, heavily armed Greek phalanx slammed into the lightly armed, surprised Persian infantry. The Battle of Marathon had begun, a terrifying, desperate collision that would define the next few critical hours. The first phase of Miltiades' audacious plan to close the distance and negate the archers had succeeded. Now came the true test, the brutal grinding hand-to-hand combat that would determine which formation could hold its nerve and its ground. The charge of the Hoplites, the thin centre and the flanking manoeuvre. The roar of the charge, my friends, must have been overwhelming. The sound of 10,000 bronze-clad hoplites sprinting the final meters, their war cries echoing off the mountainside, was the sound of a democracy betting its very existence on a single desperate maneuver. The moment of contact between the Greek phalanx and the waiting Persian line was instantaneous and brutal. Imagine the sheer physical force of that collision. The Greeks, heavily armed and armoured, hit the lightly equipped Persian and Median infantry with the momentum of their run. The bronze-faced shields, the aspis, slammed into the wicker shields of the Persians. The main weapon of the hoplite, the long ashwood spear, thrust out from the ranks, finding purchase against the exposed torsos of the enemy, whose armour was often little more than quilted linen or scale armour. This was exactly the kind of fighting the Greeks excelled at, and the kind the Persians dreaded. The Persian strength lay in their missile troops, their archers, and their cavalry. Once the Greeks had closed the distance, the archers were neutralized. Their bows were useless in this desperate, tightly packed melee. This left the Persian infantry, brave and fierce though they were, at a profound disadvantage in a simple, protracted pushing match. But the Greek line was not uniform, and this is where the genius of Miltiades' strategy truly unfolded. Recall the formation. The wings were deep and strong, packed with the most experienced Athenian and Plataean hoplites, sometimes 8 ranks deep. The centre, however, was dangerously thin, perhaps only 4 men deep. This was the trap. The initial engagement saw the Greeks succeeding instantly on the flanks. The powerful deep wings drove into the opposing Persian lines, which were composed primarily of levies from subjugated territories. The sheer weight and discipline of the deep Greek phalanx were irresistible. On both the left and right, the Greeks pushed forward, shattering the enemy formations, causing them to panic and begin a desperate retreat. But in the centre, the fighting was grim, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. As Miltiades had anticipated, the Persian commanders Datis and Artaphernes had stationed their best and most professional troops, the elite Persians and Sacae, directly opposite the Greek centre. These were the core of the great king's army, and they fought with discipline and ferocious skill. When they encountered the perilously thin Athenian centre, they found the weak point. Slowly, agonizingly, the elite Persian centre began to push the thin Greek ranks backward. The 4-deep Athenian centre could not withstand the sheer pressure and pushing weight of the professional Persian troops. This was the moment of gravest danger for the Greeks, yet it was also the moment of profound tactical success. The centre yielded, bending inward, but crucially it did not break. The Athenian hoplites were pushed backward toward the foothills, but they maintained the cohesion of their shields and spears, fighting backward inch by desperate inch. The Persian commanders, seeing their elite troops succeeding, must have believed the battle was almost won. They saw the Greek centre collapsing and rushed their best units forward, pressing their advantage, determined to split the Greek army in half. They were now fighting deep within the heart of the Greek formation, moving away from the safety of their own missile troops and logistics. They were exactly where Miltiades wanted them. The crucial moment arrived when the Greek wings achieved their objectives. The reinforced flanks, having decisively routed the weaker Persian units opposite them, now stopped their outward pursuit. Under the brilliant command structure, Miltiades had established the order was given for the Greek wings to pivot. Imagine the discipline required these hoplites having just won their section of the field, now wheeled inward, not pursuing the scattered enemy, but turning their immense bronze-plated force against the flanks and rear of the elite Persian troops who were busy pushing back the Greek centre. This was the double envelopment, a tactical masterpiece that would be studied for centuries. The Athenian and Plataean wings slammed into the flanks of the victorious Persian centre. The Persian elite, so confident in their breakthrough, suddenly found themselves surrounded on three sides. They were trapped, caught in a desperate shrinking pocket. They could no longer use their shorter weapons effectively. They were disorganized, and they were facing the long spears and heavy armor of fresh Greek troops pressing in from both the left and the right. The psychological shock must have been as devastating as the physical impact. The tide of battle turned instantly and irreversibly. The elite Persian soldiers, finding themselves enveloped and surrounded, began to waver. Their organized fighting devolved into a desperate, chaotic crush. The moment the Persian command structure fractured, the fighting spirit broke. The vast army of the King of Kings, which had only moments before tasted victory, descended into a terrified rout. The order was now simple retreat to the ships. The Greek trap had closed, the crushing embrace, the double envelopment, and the rout. My friends, the air over the plain of Marathon now carried the unmistakable scent of dust, sweat, and impending doom. We have reached the point of no return, the moment when Miltiades' audacious tactical gambit paid off in its terrifying entirety. The Greek centre had been pushed back, yielding ground as planned, successfully luring the elite forces of the Persian army, the core of the king's power, into the narrow, confined pocket formed by the reinforced Greek wings. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a Persian soldier in the centre. Just moments ago, you were victorious. You had broken the enemy's front, you were driving them toward the mountains, and the great battle seemed to be going exactly as the great king's commanders had promised. You felt the heady thrill of breakthrough. Then suddenly the noise changes. The pressure from the front eases only slightly, but overwhelming, relentless pressure begins to slam into your sides. The Greeks on the left wing, the steadfast Plataeans, and the Athenian tribesmen have turned inward, their ranks solid and deep. The Greeks on the right wing, the primary Athenian contingent, have done the same. They are not chasing scattered levies. They are pivoting to deliver a crushing blow to the main successful body of the Persian army. This was the ultimate expression of the double envelopment, a move that required extraordinary discipline, timing, and faith in a general's complex vision. The Greek wings were now effectively a hammer, slamming shut on the Persian centre, which was now disorganized, fatigued, and fighting desperately to regain its footing in a shrinking space. The heavily armoured hoplites, with their long, powerful spears and large concave shields, now engaged the elite Persians and Sake at their vulnerable flanks. The Persians, armed with shorter swords and daggers designed for swift defence, were utterly unsuited for this kind of defensive close-quarters surrounded fighting. Their wicker shields, effective against light missiles, offered almost no protection against the thrusting power of the Greek spear, especially when struck from the side. The battle became less a linear clash and more a brutal, spiraling meat grinder. The cohesion of the Persian center dissolved rapidly under the sustained, crushing pressure from three sides. The sophisticated battle formation they had marched in dissolved into a chaotic, terrified mob. The difference between the two armies was starkly illuminated. The Greeks were fighting as an organized unit, a polis in formation, relying on the bronze shield and spear of the neighbor beside them. The Persians, when their formation broke, became isolated individuals reliant only on their personal skill, which was no match for the organized collective power of the Greek phalanx. The signal for rout was not a formal order, it was a wave of collective panic that swept through the trapped Persian ranks. They realized they were completely surrounded, their line, broken their path back to safety, rapidly closing. The men began to throw down their weapons and flee desperately, trying to scramble out of the deadly Greek embrace and find any escape route toward the open beach and their waiting ships. The Greek army, sensing the breaking point of their immense enemy, transformed from a defensive wall into a relentless pursuit force. Their discipline, however, remained paramount. They held their basic ranks even as they chased the fleeing Persians, ensuring that the retreating enemy could not regroup and turn back on them. The pursuit was fierce and focused, aimed at inflicting maximum damage to ensure the king's army could not simply regroup and threaten Athens again. The Greeks pressed their advantage all the way across the plain. The battlefield, once a quiet open space, was now a scene of utter tragedy, littered with the bodies of the king's men, the discarded wicker shields, and the remnants of shattered equipment. The psychological victory was absolute. The myth of Persian invincibility, a shadow that had terrified the Aegean world for decades, was broken in a few short hours. The citizens of Athens and Plea had not merely won a battle, they had survived an existential crisis and defeated the foremost military power on earth, using not superior numbers, but superior tactics and sheer audacious courage. The routing Persian forces, now a terrified mass, fled toward the bay, struggling desperately to reach the safety of the anchored fleet. The marshlands to the north and south of the plain, which had been tactically significant in restricting the cavalry's movement earlier, now became a deadly obstacle to the fleeing Persians. Hundreds were bogged down in the mud and reeds, making them easy targets for the relentlessly pursuing Greek hoplites. The battle was not quite over, however. The fiercest final phase of the conflict was about to take place at the shoreline itself, around the very ships that the Persians hoped would carry them to safety. The Greeks were determined to capture the fleet, removing the final terrifying threat to Athens. The pursuit of the broken enemy continued, culminating in a desperate last-ditch stand where men fought for their very lives on the beaches of Marathon. The total casualty figures, as recorded by Herodotus, tell the astonishing story of the tactical brilliance the Persians lost, an estimated 6,400 men, while the Athenians lost only 192 of their own citizens, plus 11 Plataeans. The imbalance was staggering, a testament to the fatal combination of Miltiades' flanking maneuver and the protection offered by the Greek bronze armor. The hoplite had proven his worth, and the young democracy had secured a miracle. But the victory, though profound, was not yet complete. The Persian fleet remained a threat, and the undefended city of Athens lay just beyond the mountains. The war was about to enter its second desperate act, the slaughter on the beach, retreat casualties, and the race against time. The roar of the Greek war cries, my friends, did not abate when the Persian center broke. Instead, it became a sound of ferocious, relentless pursuit. The victory was swift and decisive, but Miltiades and his victorious Hoplites knew that a partial victory was no victory at all. The goal was not merely to defeat the Persian army on the field, but to destroy the expedition so utterly that the great king would not soon attempt another invasion. Imagine the sheer physical agony of this chase. These hoplites, citizen soldiers, who were farmers and craftsmen, had just executed a full-speed charge in 70 pounds of bronze armour, fought a brutal, sustained melee, and now were running again, chasing a panicked, diverse enemy across the wide plain. Their lungs must have been burning, their limbs aching, yet the knowledge of what lay ahead, the salvation of their city, drove them on. They followed the terrified Persian masses across the plain, a bronze tidal wave, seeking to wash the enemy back into the sea. The Persian retreat was a desperate scramble for survival. In their panic, they headed straight for the easiest point of escape, the beach where their long ships were drawn up. But the geography that had once favoured them now turned into a deadly accomplice of the Greeks. The north end of the plain particularly was riddled with thick coastal marshland. Hundreds of Persians, heavily laden with their equipment, plunged into the viscous mud and reeds where they were instantly trapped, becoming easy, tragic prey for the pursuing Greeks, or simply drowning in their desperation. The historian Herodotus records the slaughter on the plain and in the swamps as the Persian discipline dissolved into self-preservation. The final bloodiest phase of the battle occurred right on the shoreline around the transports. Here the struggle was brutal, chaotic, and focused on the enemy's ships. The fleeing Persian soldiers scrambled onto their vessels, cutting the moorings and pushing off into the shallow waters, while the Greeks, frenzied by victory, fought to seize the fleet before it could escape. This was a hand-to-hand fight between the triumphant Hoplites and the professional Persian marines and oarsmen who defended the vessels. The Greeks, despite their exhaustion, attempted to board and secure the ships. It was in this final desperate melee that the Athenians paid their highest price. The polemarch Callimachus, the man whose single vote had authorized the attack, fought with incredible bravery at the head of the Athenian line. He was killed here, right at the stern of one of the ships, falling in the same location as his comrade and fellow general Stesilaus, who also perished. They died not in the grand maneuver on the field, but in the gritty, essential struggle to prevent the enemy's escape. Ultimately, the Persians' immense logistical advantage won out at the shoreline. The sheer number of ships and the speed of the re-embarkation meant that the majority of the fleet, though carrying a shattered army, was able to pull away from the shore and set sail. The Greeks secured a powerful symbolic and practical victory by managing to capture only 7 of the massive Persian warships. The sight of these captured trireme symbols of the king's power was a powerful sight, but the greater fleet was gone. The tragedy was appalling, and the official casualty figures, as preserved by Herodotus, tell a story of almost mythical proportions, underscoring the revolutionary success of Miltiades' tactic. The Persian casualties were counted at 6,400 men. These were the men who fell on the plain, were swallowed by the marshes, and were cut down on the beaches. The Greek loss was astonishingly low: 192 Athenian citizens and 11 Plataean allies. This ratio of roughly 30-1 remains a profound testament to the superiority of the heavy phalanx when pitted against lighter infantry in close combat proving that discipline and bronze armor could overcome sheer numerical superiority. The initial jubilation of the Greek victory was fierce, but it was abruptly curtailed by the highest military awareness of Miltiades. The defeated Persian fleet was not sailing immediately back to Asia. It was regrouping offshore, and then it began to move. The commanders Datis and Artaphernes refused to accept defeat and execute their secondary prearranged plan. They sailed the bulk of the fleet south around the massive promontory of Cape Sunion, heading straight for the undefended city of Athens. The original fear of Hippias's treachery was suddenly amplified. The commanders may have believed that with the Athenian army exhausted and occupied at Marathon, the collaborators in Athens would finally raise the signal, perhaps that legendary shining shield, on the hills above the city to welcome the Persian fleet at the port of Phaleron. The Athenian army standing amidst the dead on the plain instantly understood the threat. Their families, their temples, their nascent democracy, everything they had fought and bled for was now stripped bare and vulnerable. They had bought time, but not safety. The battle was won, but the war for Athens was about to enter its final, critical phase. The army was shattered by fatigue. They had marched over 20 miles to reach Marathon, fought the most brutal battle of their lives, and now they faced an impossible demand. They had to get back to Athens, 26 miles away, before the Persian fleet could complete its voyage around Sunion and land at Phaleron. The gods had given them a tactical victory, but the defense of their city now depended on one last monumental feat of endurance. Without pause, without ceremony for the dead, the order was given for the entire victorious army to turn around and begin a forced march, a taxis back across the rugged roads of Attica. The race for Athens had begun. The swift return, the Athenian army's 26-mile forced march, the victory on the plain of Marathon. My friends, was a thing of bronze and blood, a moment of profound exultation. Yet the celebration lasted only as long as it took for Miltiades to cast his eyes upon the retreating Persian fleet and realize the depth of the continuing peril. The enemy generals Datis and Artaphernes had failed in their primary objective, but they were still capable of executing their contingency plan, an attack on the undefended city of Athens. The Athenian hoplites, standing exhausted among the 600 Persian dead, had earned rest. But rest was denied them. They were instantly ordered into what would become one of the most remarkable forced marches in military history. This march was the true final act of the Battle of Marathon, the desperate, grueling race that secured the physical and political life of the city. The distance from the battlefield to the city was roughly 26 miles, 42 kilometers, over uneven mountainous terrain. The soldiers were heavy infantry, wearing the 70 pounds of armor they had just charged and fought in. They were dehydrated, running on adrenaline and the fumes of sheer terror. Yet their motivation was absolute. Their homes, their families, and the fragile structure of their democracy were at stake. They had to arrive before the Persian fleet. Miltiades drove his men relentlessly. This was no ordinary military parade. It was a desperate, high-stakes forced march or taxis. The general understood the geometry of the race perfectly. A swift Athenian trireme sailing around the long promontory of Cape Sunion at the tip of Attica would take many hours, but could ultimately outpace a weary army marching overland. Time was the critical factor, measured not in days, but in hours. The Athenian and Plataean forces began their grueling march, immediately abandoning the field and leaving a small detachment of light-armed troops behind to guard the dead and watch the departing enemy. We must imagine the agony of that journey. They moved as fast as was humanly possible, the heavy shields dragging on their shoulders, the heat of the Attic sun beating down the bronze armor, becoming an oven. They pushed through the passes and over the hills that separated Marathon from the Athenian plain, driven forward by Miltiades and the strategoi, who moved among the ranks, shouting encouragement and reminding the men of the fate of Eretria. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet was executing its maneuver. Datis and Artaphernes, though defeated on land, still held the powerful belief that their mission could be salvaged. They sailed south the oars, dipping relentlessly, pushing the demoralized but disciplined fleet toward the Bay of Phaleron, the ancient port of Athens. If they could arrive and land their forces, perhaps including those precious cavalry units they had been saving, at the very moment the collaborators raised the signal, they would have achieved the primary objective of their expedition, the political subjugation of Athens. The defeat at Marathon would be quickly forgotten in the triumph of seizing the city. The tension in Athens itself must have been unbearable. The elderly, the women and the children remaining behind had no news other than the initial alarm and the subsequent terrifying silence. Had the army won? Had they been annihilated? Or were they simply trapped? The sight of the Persian fleet, an immense moving threat, would have been visible on the horizon long before it reached Phaleron, confirming their worst fears. Then, just as the Persian fleet was nearing the Bay of Phaleron, preparing to drop anchor and launch the final decisive assault, the miracle of Athenian endurance materialized. Against all logistical odds, the Athenian army completed its forced march. They arrived back at Athens exhausted, dust-covered, and utterly spent, but ready for battle. They moved instantly to secure the city. Miltiades deployed his forces on the hills overlooking the Bay of Phaleron, the area where the Persians would have to land. Imagine the moment of realization for the Persian commanders. Datis and Artaphernes arrived at Phaleron, their eyes scanning the hills for the prearranged signal from Hippias's faction, the shining shield, and instead of seeing a welcoming defenseless city, they saw the bronze-clad line of the same Athenian army they had just fought at Marathon, standing ready and waiting for them. The Hoplites had covered 26 miles in less than 10 hours, arriving just in time. The effect was instantaneous and demoralizing. The Persian commanders recognized the situation immediately. Their army was shattered, their morale was broken by the defeat at Marathon, and the swiftness of the Athenian response was an unanswerable testament to the courage and discipline of their foe. The element of surprise was gone. Their only path to victory, a quick seizure of an undefended city, was closed. To attempt another landing and fight a second large-scale battle against the ready and victorious Hoplites would have been suicidal folly. Datis gave the order. The ships did not anchor. They turned east and began the long, somber voyage back to Asia. The first Persian invasion of Greece was over. Athens was saved not by a single battlefield victory, but by the combined acts of tactical genius and superhuman endurance. The victory was secured not just at Marathon, but on the dust-choked roads of Attica. The Spartans, bound by their sacred rites, finally arrived the following day, after the full moon had passed. They had marched with all the speed their laws allowed, but they were too late for the battle. They travelled to Marathon, viewed the immense burial mound, and the thousands of Persian dead littering the field, and offered their congratulations to the triumphant Athenians. It was an acknowledgement of Athenian prowess, a moment of profound validation for the young democracy, but it also cemented a historical truth. Athens had won this victory alone. The immediate threat was gone. The surviving Athenian hoplites, finally released from duty, could mourn their dead and celebrate their survival. The Battle of Marathon was now complete. The legacy, however, was just beginning. The Athenians would forever venerate the 192 citizens who fell burying them not in the city's main cemetery, but uniquely in a great communal burial mound, the Soros, right on the battlefield where they fell. This was an unprecedented honor, signaling that these men were not just war dead, they were the sacred guardians of Athenian liberty. The spirit of those men and the idea they fought for would soon inspire a golden age, the enduring legacy, a turning point for democracy and the West. The stillness returned to Attica, broken now only by the solemn work of burying the dead and the quiet astonishment of the living. The dust of the great Battle of Marathon settled, revealing a landscape utterly changed, not just physically, but symbolically. What had transpired in those few brutal hours on the plain and the superhuman effort of the forced march back to Athens was immediately understood by the Athenians and soon after by the world as a moment of transcendental historical significance. The first act of commemoration was one of profound respect and unique honor. The 192 Athenian citizens who fell in the battle along with the 11 Plataeans were granted a distinction never before bestowed upon the war dead of the city. They were not brought back to the common cemetery in Athens. Instead, they were interred directly on the battlefield itself, beneath a massive communal mound of earth known as the Soros. This sacred tomb stands to this day a silent, powerful testament to the sacrifice of the heroes of Marathon. This unique burial symbolized that these men were the sacred guardians of the democracy, their graves serving as the permanent border of Athenian liberty, a perpetual reminder of the price paid for freedom. The arrival of the Spartans the day after the battle only served to underscore the achievement. Having marched with commendable speed once the religious restrictions of the Carnea were lifted, the Spartan army viewed the Persian dead and offered their congratulations to the Athenians. This acknowledgement from the greatest military power in Greece was immense. Marathon was not only a victory, it was Athens's proclamation that its citizen soldiers fighting for their young democracy were the equal of any professional force, even the legendary Hoplites of Sparta. The significance of Marathon was multi-layered, shaping not just the immediate future of Greece, but the trajectory of Western civilization itself. 1. The triumph of Greek identity and military prowess. For decades, the Greeks had lived under the shadow of Persian invincibility. Marathon shattered that myth. It proved that the heavy bronze armor, the long spear, and the disciplined collective force of the hoplite phalanx could overcome the massed archers and lighter armament of the Persian forces in a close-quarters clash. The tactical brilliance of Miltiades' double envelopment became a legend demonstrating that intelligence and strategy could triumph over sheer numerical superiority. The battle instilled in the Greeks an extraordinary sense of confidence and unity, showing them that resistance was possible and that Eleutheria, freedom, was a cause worth fighting for even against impossible odds. 2. The preservation of Athenian democracy. This is perhaps the deepest layer of the battle's legacy. Had Athens fallen as Eretria, had the nascent democratic experiment would have been extinguished in its infancy. The victory secured the political space for the Athenian system of governance to survive, grow, and flourish. The decade that followed Marathon saw Athens enter its golden age, a period of unparalleled creativity in philosophy, drama, architecture, and science. Parthenon, the tragedies of Sophocles, the philosophy of Socrates, all these cultural achievements were built upon the foundation of that day at Marathon. As historians often argue, had the Persians won the entire cultural, political, and philosophical output that forms the basis of Western thought might never have developed. 3. Political realignment and future strategy. The victory propelled Athens to the forefront of Greek politics. The memory of the Spartan delay reinforced Athenian self-reliance and convinced a generation of Athenian leaders, notably Themistocles, who was also a general at Marathon, that the future defense of Greece lay not just on land but at sea. Themistocles famously argued for using the wealth from newly discovered silver mines at Laurium to build a massive fleet of 200 triremes. This decision, driven by the foresight that Darius's son Xerxes would inevitably return, transformed Athens into the dominant naval power of the Aegean, a transformation that would prove decisive in the later stages of the Greco-Persian Wars. 4. The genesis of the Marathon race. And finally, the enduring cultural legacy that transcends military history, the modern Marathon race. While the ancient sources, particularly Herodotus, confirm the exhausting 150-mile run of Pheidippides before the battle to seek aid from Sparta, the more famous story, the run after the battle, was popularized centuries later. This legend recounts the messenger running the 26 miles from the battlefield to Athens to announce the victory. Nenica Kamen, we have won, before collapsing and dying. Regardless of its historical accuracy, this tale captured the imagination of the world and was immortalized in 1896 when the modern Olympic Games were inaugurated in Athens. The organizers sought an event that encapsulated the ancient spirit of Greek heroism, endurance, and the defense of civilization. The marathon race was born linking a single athletic feat of sacrifice directly to the political and military fate of a continent. The Battle of Marathon was not the end of the conflict. It was merely the first glorious chapter. 10 years later, King Xerxes would return with a force so immense it dwarfed the army of Datis. Battles like Thermopylae Salamis and Plataea would follow. But when the Greeks faced those overwhelming challenges, they did so with the knowledge that they were not fighting an impossible foe. They were fighting an enemy they had already defeated on the sacred ground of Attica. The memory of the Soros, the courage of Miltiades, and the tireless legs of the runners became the moral backbone of Greek resistance. Marathon was the day when a new idea, the democratic citizen free and prepared to die for his right to self-govern, stood firm against the immensity of ancient imperial despotism. It was the moment when Athens saved itself and in doing so secured the future of the world we now inhabit. The tale of Marathon closes here, a story complete in its own arc of defiant strategy and ultimate deliverance. We leave the plain of Marathon forever marked as the place where the West earned its beginning.